person who is featured on Brian Kohberger's phone, the female victim who was featured on Brian Kohberger's phone, is the same person that he was reaching out to on social media.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, that person that Kohberger was reaching out to was Maddie Mogen. Why do you think Kohberger felt a connection to her, to one of the Idaho students more than the others? Well, we know that Kohberger messaged Maddie Mogen on Instagram weeks before the killings. Do you remember that story made the news on January 18th? That's a little bit more than a month ago, a month and 5 days ago. And only then we didn't know who he was messaging. We knew that he was messaging someone. We knew that he said, "Hey, how are you?" And he did it again and again without an answer. Well, now we know who that was directed towards. We also know that he was liking every picture Maddie put up and also downloading her pictures onto his phone. And then he even went as far as I've said, making contact. And if you think about those pictures she was putting up, they were pretty provocative. They were pretty quite sexy, quite definitely catch your attention. And so, according to people, it was clear that Kohberger was paying attention to Maddie. But why Maggie? Why not Kaylee? Why not Xana? Why not either of the survivors? What made Maddie different? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'm going to be doing episode 36 of the Van Gogh letters later today, so look out for that. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So Ashley Banfield starts her analysis a little cryptically, kind of putting it out there that he was more attracted to one of the girls. She doesn't identify who that is to begin with. And then finally acknowledges at about the 1 minute mark that although he was following both Kaylee and Maddie's accounts, he was liking every single one of Maddie's posts compared to just some of Kaylee's.
Kohberger had liked all of Maddie's photos compared to liking just a couple of the ones on Kaylee's account.
So what insights do we draw from this? Well, I think there are a few of them. First of all, the killings were targeted after all. We can see how the killer did potentially target one particular victim. He was drawn towards one particular victim, and perhaps how the killings were to some extent targeted and not specifically targeted at the same time. It also makes sense that the killer went upstairs to find Maddie, into Maddie's room to find Maddie first. And who knows, perhaps he didn't expect Kaylee to be there, or for Murphy to be there, or for Ethan to be there. And it's also possible that he only intended killing Maddie. Then there's also the connection to the victims. This has been spoken about for quite a long time. How was the killer connected to the victims? In hindsight, it doesn't seem so surprising that there was a connection to the victims, but the connection was basically achieved remotely via social media, and then a little more closely via peeping Tomming. But the question still arises, why Maddie? Why not Kaylee? Why not Xana? I've got to say, my first impression with the Idaho case was that I thought Madison was the target. If you look at Hoodie Guy and the interactions with Maddie, anyway, there are interactions with Maddie, not so much with Kaylee. And so it was difficult for me to decide whether what I was thinking, what I was feeling, whether that was projection or whether the killer would decide something similar, whether he would decide perhaps that Madison was particularly pretty, because obviously all of that kind of thing is subjective. But I certainly thought that Madison was really a pretty girl, and it may also be that he'd had a few personal encounters, a few direct encounters with her at the Mad Greek, and maybe it felt something in person, then followed her on social media, and then he'd sort of gotten lost in the psychological woods of becoming obsessed, becoming fixated, falling in love with her basically online, downloading her pictures, looking at her pictures, right? And she was simply serving a customer. And don't forget, Maddie had a boyfriend. But he was extremely lonely, and she obviously became the focus of his fixations, the focus of his fantasy. If only she would answer a message, if only she would talk to me, if only we could have a pizza together, if only something could happen between me and her. And I think you've kind of got to ask the question, knowing what we know about Kohberger. I mean, he couldn't get any girlfriend at all anyway. So maybe going for Maddie is kind of delusional. Is it delusional or lovesick? Now, let me ask you a question. Before we address this aspect, Kohberger's delusional fixation on Maddie, I've asked it before, and I ask it often in terms of our approach to the underlying reality. For example, in the Kylie Rodney case, does it really matter if you think it's foul play, if perhaps it wasn't foul play? Does it really matter if you're convinced it was an accident, if it was actually something else, right? So what if the underlying reality, the authentic narrative, the real story of true crime cases is actually something else to what you think it is? What if it's often different to what you think it is? Does it matter? Does it matter if we don't know the authentic narrative? Is it okay if we speculate and go off track and have our own opinion not based on facts or reason or common sense or reality? Is it okay if our analysis is totally wrong? Isn't it harmless if we often get things wrong? You know, we're human beings who make mistakes. Is it really that bad? Is it so bad to turn reality into a kind of entertainment? Turn reality topics like crime into kind of fiction? Is there anything wrong with that? Is it harmless to go off track in terms of your relationship with reality, including towards people around you? And you might say, of course it's harmless. Well, was it harmless for Brian? Was it harmless for Brian to lose track with reality? Was it harmless for Brian to go off track in terms of his relationship with reality, including towards people like Madison? Was it harmless for Madison, for someone near her, to be losing touch with reality? Because that's exactly what he was doing. Was it really doing any harm for Brian to be a little delusional about his chances with Maddie? So what if he was a little unrealistic? So what if there was some wishful thinking thrown in there? I'm sure that is what Kohberger was thinking. So what if I'm attracted to this girl? So what if I'm looking at her Instagram every day? So what if I'm having little kind of ideas? So what if I invest a little bit in those ideas? So what if I'm losing touch with reality a little bit? Isn't everybody? So what if I'm thinking I'm the kind of guy Maddie might date? So what if I'm caught up in a fairy tale, a fantasy of Maddie and me? So what if he's downloading pictures, looking at them repeatedly and obsessing over them? No, losing touch with reality is never good. It's never helpful and nearly always harmful. Because like being high or on drugs, the effect wears off eventually. And then coming face to face with reality can be jarring and painful. And the more you are escaping reality, the less practice you have at dealing with it. And the more maladaptive you are, in other words, the less effective you are in the real world. Is that what you want to be? Not ineffective in the real world, because that's what Brian was. That's what criminals are, ineffective in the real world. They commit crimes because they can't respond effectively to what's happening around them. Do you want to be ineffective in your world? So how can you become more effective? Well, by figuring out how to think more critically about your reality. And that starts by being able to think more critically about someone else's reality. That's kind of a safe space to attempt that, to practice that. Incidentally, I think Brian's saying recently that he believes he will be exonerated. He actually means acquitted. Exoneration happens after you've been found guilty. But I think him saying that, and this is recently, shows to what extent he's not a particularly clever person. he doesn't know the distinction. He's not even aware of that distinction, even though he's studying criminology. And I also think it's not just that, it's to what extent I think he's delusional still in the aftermath of this case. He wasn't just delusional about Maddie. He's delusional in general. He's out of touch in general with reality. And so that contaminates everything. You just are ineffective about literally everything. It's the same delusional approach to everything. So again, what is the antidote? If we take Kohberger, if he was aiming a lot lower, if he was less arrogant, if he was just trying to make friends, not with the most attractive girls, but just with those around him, and perhaps taking it a little bit more casual, being a little bit less intense about it, being a little bit more sort of kind of conversational and less intense. Perhaps he would have graduated up the ladders of social status. People who would have gotten to know him. Maybe there were a few things to like about him. Maybe he was quite witty. Maybe he had some interesting ideas. But he wanted to run before he could walk. He wanted to fly before he tested his wings. He wanted to dominate while he was still in a kind of a socially weak position. And all of this is sort of the rookie mistake someone with zero experience of the real world makes. So do you still think not being in touch with reality is harmless? Do you still think not being able to tell the difference between what's real and true in true crime and what's not doesn't matter? Do you still think if I make a complaint against someone else who's pushing a narrative that doesn't really make sense, like, just let them say what they're going to do. It's their opinion. Do you think it doesn't matter? Do you still think creators who encourage you to speculate on popular theories that aren't anchored in the facts and don't actually make sense, do you think that is good for you or good for society? Do you think it is good to just dismiss the fact that you have opposing opinions that can't be reconciled? Because someone's got to be on the right track and someone's got to be on the wrong track. Is it okay for people to be on the wrong track? Or should you be concerned, not only that you're on the right track, but be concerned about those who aren't? Now again, let's go back to Brian. According to People magazine, quote, the man accused of killing 4 University of Idaho students last November allegedly had pictures of one of the female victims on his phone. A phone that belonged to Brian Kohberger was collected after his arrest. According to the source, authorities found pictures of the victim on the device. The source did not specify whether they were photos that he had taken of her or if they were downloaded from her social media, but I think we do know that they were downloaded from social media. And there was more than one picture of her. It's clear that he was paying attention to her. So if Brian Kohberger was becoming increasingly delusional in Pullman, if you're staying up late at night and he's paying attention to someone in a way that's not realistic, and maybe you are that person, maybe it's your photos that are being downloaded, you think there's anything wrong with that? Someone just losing touch with reality a bit, and they're lonely, and they start focusing quite a lot of their attention on you. Do you think there's anything wrong with that? It's just their opinion, So what if it's not true? Well, he was paying attention to her, and she wasn't paying attention to him. That was the reality. And from that situation, somehow he turned that into a personal vendetta. Does that make sense? Does it make sense that someone reaches out to someone else on social media? They don't know that person. They don't respond, but the person reaching out turns that into a personal vendetta. It's suddenly personal. Does that make sense? It does for someone with a twisted sense of reality. It does make sense for someone losing touch with reality. Do you see why being realistic matters? Do you see why being delusional and disconnected from reality is dangerous? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.